A 4-foot wide roll of reflective foil sitting in the insulation aisle of your local hardware store. $150, give or take. Most container builders walk right past it on their way to buy spray foam and never think about it again. The ones who don't walk past it end up installing an HVAC system that costs $12,000 less than the one their neighbor just had quoted, for the exact same square footage, the exact same climate, the exact same container. I'm going to show you exactly what this product is, why it works on a level most builders never think about, how the $12,000 number actually happens. Because it's not the product saving you that money directly, and the specific installation details that separate a radiant barrier that actually performs from one that does almost nothing. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why HVAC contractors who specialize in container homes ask one specific question before they even quote your job, and it's not the question you'd expect. If you're new here, we cover container homes with real numbers every single week. No fantasy claims, no sponsored nonsense. Subscribe now, because the HVAC sizing math in this video is going to change how you spec your entire mechanical system. Let's start with why this even matters, because you need to understand how HVAC contractors actually size a system before the $12,000 number makes any sense at all. Every legitimate HVAC installer is supposed to run what's called a manual J-load calculation before quoting your equipment. That calculation takes your square footage, your window area, your insulation values, your climate zone, and critically, your roof's solar heat gain, and spits out a number in BTUs, the actual cooling and heating capacity your house needs. The problem on a container home specifically is that corrugated steel is one of the worst performing materials in that entire calculation. We've talked before on this channel about how a bare steel roof under direct sun can hit surface temperatures past 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and every one of those degrees gets factored into your manual J as radiant heat load the system has to fight. A lot of contractors, especially ones who haven't built many container homes specifically, respond to that high radiant load the safe way, which is oversizing. They spec a bigger mini split, or 2 zones instead of 1, because nobody wants to get a callback complaint that the house doesn't cool properly in July. That safety margin is exactly where your $12,000 disappears. In equipment you didn't need to buy, electrical capacity you didn't need to add, and line sets you didn't need to run. Here's what a radiant barrier actually does to that calculation, and the physics matter here, because this is not the same thing as regular insulation, and a lot of builders confuse the two. Standard insulation, whether it's spray foam or batt, works by slowing conductive heat transfer, heat moving through a material by direct contact. It's rated an R value, and it does an excellent job of that specific job. A radiant barrier works completely differently. It's a reflective surface, typically aluminum foil laminated to a substrate, sometimes with a layer of air-filled bubble wrap sandwiched in the middle for a small amount of added R value. And its entire function is reflecting radiant heat, the infrared energy radiating directly off a hot surface, before it ever gets a chance to become conductive heat that your insulation then has to slow down. Emissivity is the number that matters here. 9, meaning it radiates about 90% of the heat energy, hitting it straight through to whatever's below. 0.5, meaning it reflects back somewhere around 95 to 97% of that radiant energy instead of passing it along. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between your roof acting like a heat lamp pointed at your ceiling and your roof acting like a mirror. Now, here's the installation detail that separates a radiant barrier that actually performs from one that's a complete waste of $150. And this is the part almost nobody explains correctly. A radiant barrier only works if it faces an air gap. Reflective surfaces need open air on at least one side to actually reflect radiant energy. If you sandwich foil directly between 2 solid materials with no airspace, it loses almost all of its reflective benefit and behaves more like a vapor barrier than a radiant barrier. This is exactly why the ventilated purlin system we covered in the single slope roof video matters here specifically. That elevated single slope structure creates a continuous air gap between the container's original roof panel and the new upper roofing surface, typically 4 to 8 inches. And that gap is precisely where a radiant barrier needs to live to do its job. Installed with the reflective foil side facing down into that ventilated cavity, stapled or taped across the underside of the purlins before the finished roofing goes on, The barrier intercepts radiant heat coming off the hot upper roof surface and reflects the vast majority of it right back out through the ridge vent, before it ever has a chance to warm the air in that cavity or transfer down into the container's original steel ceiling panel below. On a flat, unvented roof assembly with no air gap, the same product installed the same way delivers a fraction of that performance, which is why the single slope ventilation design and the radiant barrier work as a system, not as two separate upgrades. Let's talk about real numbers, both for the product itself and for what it actually changes downstream. A standard roll of radiant barrier, 4 feet wide by 125 feet long, giving you 500 square feet of coverage, runs $120 to $170, depending on brand and whether it's the single-layer foil version or the version with the air bubble core for a small R-value boost. A typical 3-container, 960 square foot roof needs roughly 2 rolls to cover the full span with reasonable overlap at the seams, putting your total material cost at $240 to $340, plus a box of staples or foil tape, another $15 to $25. Installation, if you're doing it yourself while the purlin structure is already open and accessible before the finished roofing goes on, is genuinely a half-day job for 2 people. If you're paying a contractor to install it as part of the roofing sequence, expect an added $400 to $700 in labor, since it has to be done carefully, overlapped and taped correctly at every seam, or you create gaps that undermine the whole system. Now here's where the $12,000 actually comes from, and I want to walk through this honestly instead of just throwing the number at you. This isn't the radiant barrier saving you money directly at the checkout counter. It's the radiant barrier changing the input numbers on your manual J calculation, enough that your HVAC contractor can legitimately spec a smaller system instead of an oversized one. On a typical 3-container, 960 square foot home in a moderate to hot climate, a bare or minimally protected steel roof with standard spray foam insulation, but no radiant barrier often pushes a manual J calculation toward an 18,000 to 24,000 BTU system, frequently specified as 2 separate mini-split zones to handle the load with confidence, especially if the contractor is building in a safety margin, because they're less familiar with container-specific roof performance. A properly vented single-slope roof with a correctly installed radiant barrier in that air gap can lower the calculated cooling load enough to bring that same 960 square foot home down into a single 12,000 to 15,000 BTU zone in a lot of climates. Sometimes even a single well-placed 9,000 to 12,000 BTU unit if the rest of the envelope, windows, spray foam thickness, is dialed in. Here's what that difference actually costs. A 2-zone mini-split system, 2 indoor heads, an outdoor condenser size to run both, the additional line sets, and the electrical work to support 2 separate zones. Typically runs $9,500 to $13,500 installed for a build this size, including the added 20 to 30 amp electrical circuit work often required for a larger dual-zone outdoor unit. A single-zone system sized correctly after the radiant barrier and ventilation work lowers your calculated load runs $3,500 to $5,500 installed on a smaller electrical circuit, with a single line set run instead of 2. Do that math across a real range of quotes, and you land almost exactly in the range that gives this video its title. A difference commonly falling between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on your specific climate zone, your container configuration, and how aggressively your contractor was sizing for safety margin before the radiant barrier and ventilation numbers came into the calculation. Let me walk you through 2 real examples so this doesn't just feel like a spreadsheet exercise. The first is a 2-container build outside Amarillo, Texas, hot summers, cold winters, real temperature swings both directions. The original HVAC, quote, based on a manual J run before the builder had finalized the roof assembly, came back at 22,000 BTUs across 2 zones, installed cost $11,800. After switching to a vented single-slope roof with a radiant barrier installed in the air gap, and rerunning the manual J with the updated roof assembly numbers, the contractor requoted at a single 14,000 BTU zone, installed cost $4,600. Total savings on the HVAC line item alone, $7,200, against a radiant barrier material cost of roughly $280. The second is a single container build in rural Oklahoma, smaller footprint at 320 square feet, but built with a particularly steep summer heat gain problem because the original site plan had almost no shade on the roof. Original HVAC, quote, a 12,000 BTU single-zone system sized with a heavy safety margin because of that unshaded roof exposure, installed cost $5,200. After the radiant barrier install and a rerun of the calculation, the contractor was comfortable dropping to a 9,000 BTU unit, installed cost $3,400. Smaller savings in absolute dollars on a smaller build, $1,800. But it's proportionally one of the larger percentage reductions in the group, and it came from a $150 roll of foil and a half day of labor. Now, the honest limitations, because I'm not going to sell you a fantasy number without the caveats that go with it. First, a radiant barrier is not a substitute for proper spray foam insulation on your container's interior. It addresses radiant heat gain through the roof specifically. It does nothing for conductive heat loss through your walls, your windows, or your floor. And if those parts of your envelope are under-insulated, no amount of foil on your roof is going to get you to a smaller HVAC system, because the load calculation accounts for the whole building, not just the roof. Second, this only delivers real performance inside a properly vented air gap. If you're building with a flat roof directly over the container with no elevated purlin structure and no ventilation channel, installing a radiant barrier without that airspace gives you a fraction of the benefit. And I'd honestly tell you not to bother unless you're also changing your roof assembly to create that gap. Third, your actual HVAC savings depend entirely on your climate zone and your contractor actually rerunning a proper manual J calculation with the updated roof numbers. If your contractor is quoting off a rule of thumb, square footage per ton estimate instead of a real load calculation, they may never adjust their number downward at all, even if your roof assembly genuinely justifies it. Which means part of capturing this savings is making sure whoever you hire is actually doing the math correctly, not guessing. And fourth, in extremely hot, high humidity climates, the Gulf Coast, South Florida, some builders still choose to keep a slightly larger margin in their equipment sizing regardless of radiant barrier performance, specifically to handle humidity removal during sustained heat waves, not just temperature. The radiant barrier still helps in those climates, but the savings gap may run toward the smaller end of the range rather than the larger end. So who should be doing this? Anyone building a single slope roof on a container home. Since you already have the ventilated air gap, this product needs to actually work, meaning the incremental cost to add it is close to nothing. Anyone in a hot or moderate climate where radiant roof heat gain is a meaningful chunk of your total cooling load to begin with. And anyone getting an HVAC quote before their roof assembly is finalized, because that's the leverage point. Get your roof design locked in, radiant barrier included, before your contractor runs the manual J, not after they've already quoted equipment based on a bare steel roof assumption. Here's what I want you to walk away with. $150 is not the number that matters in this video's title. It's the entry point to a decision that happens weeks later, at the exact moment your HVAC contractor sits down to size your equipment. Get the roof assembly right first, radiant barrier installed correctly in a properly vented gap, and you're not just making your house more comfortable. You're changing the actual input numbers your contractor uses to spec your equipment, and that's where thousands of dollars either stay in your pocket or get spent on capacity you never needed in the first place. If you're planning a container build and you haven't gotten your HVAC quote yet, drop your state and your container configuration in the comments, and I'll tell you honestly what BTU range you should be seeing once your roof assembly is dialed in correctly. I read every single comment. If this changed how you're thinking about your HVAC budget, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people trying to build smart instead of overpaying for capacity they'll never use. And subscribe, because next week we're walking through how to read a manual J report line by line, so you know exactly what questions to ask your contractor before you sign off on equipment sizing. See you in the next one.